Chapter 2. Wednesday, the 25th of November, 1709, Alva, Scotland. James Ritchie was thoroughly miserable. The carriage ride from Falkirk had been cold, damp, and uncomfortable. And if that wasn't enough, it was raining, and not just a light rain either. It was, as the locals would say, bucketing down. Menacing storm clouds were casting great shadows low across the Ogle Hills. It was only 4:30 in the afternoon, but already the brightness of day was disappearing into night. The gloomy sky just added to Ritchie's misery, reminding him of shorter days and the long wintry nights which were fast approaching. As a boy, Ritchie had been lucky enough to have had a little schooling, and as a result he had found employment with John Hardy Limited, a Falkirk-based land surveying company. In the early days, he'd loved his job and found it new and exciting. When he had joined the company at the age of 12, old Mr. Hardy had remarked that it shown great promise and took it upon himself to equip Ritchie with the skills needed for business. However, 9 years later, that all changed when the old man suddenly died of a heart attack. After the funeral, William, the elder of the two surviving Hardy sons, moved quickly to take control of his father's company. From that point on, what had been a promising career for the 28-year-old now became nothing more than a workday position as a courier responsible for the delivery of mundane documents to mundane clients. As the carriage bumped and jerked its way along the rough track, Ritchie drew breath, shook his head and sighed in sheer disbelief at how stupid he'd been. Brushing down his once smart bottle-green coat with his hand, he gazed down at the brown leather satchel sitting on his lap. In his head he could hear his wife's voice repeating over and over, "I told you so. I told you would make a bloody fool out of you." "Aye, Jenny," Ritchie thought. "You was right, as usual." Looking outwards towards the hills, Ritchie noticed the familiar outline of 3 neglected, almost derelict farm cottages, indicating their arrival in Alva. Taking a deep breath, he groped under his seat, fumbling and eventually retrieving a large wooden stick. Firmly taking hold of the end, he proceeded to bang the carriage roof 3 times in order to gain the driver's attention. After a few momentary jerks, Ritchie felt the carriage begin to slow, and eventually it rocked to a halt. The carriage shook as the driver leaned over and cleared his throat. "Are you okay, Mr. Ritchie, sir?" Ritchie sat up and leaned out of the right side of the carriage, straining his neck upwards as he attempted to make eye contact with the driver. "Aye, I'm braw, Tam. How much further?" The elderly driver held his breath for what seemed like an eternity, while he surveyed the location. "Well, this is it, Alva. What was the name of that chap that you wanted to see?" Looking down at the satchel, Ritchie untied its leather laces and pulled out several pieces of parchment. After a moment of struggling with the deteriorating light, he eventually made out the name. Clearing his throat, he again strained towards the driver. "Dougie Allan," he shouted. "Oh, Dougie! Aye, in that case we're just about there." The carriage juddered again as Tam repositioned himself back into his driving seat. After a loud crack of his whip, the carriage again rocked into motion. With barely enough time to return the document to its satchel, the horses were once again slowing. Ritchie sat up and adjusted his tunic in an attempt to make himself look more presentable. As the carriage rocked for a final time, the elderly, somewhat scruffy driver jumped down, walked around and pulled the right-hand side door carriage open. Placing the satchel under his right arm, Ritchie jumped out of the coach. Even in the rain and after 2 hours an uncomfortable journey, it was a welcome relief. As he looked around, Tam, the driver, was already climbing back into his seat. "What time would you like to return to Falkirk, Mr. Ritchie, sir?" Pausing for thought, Ritchie replied, "Could you please stay? I shouldn't think I'll be too long." Repositioning himself in the driver's seat, Tam nodded in acknowledgement and replied, "Aye, nae bother." Ahead of him lay Dougie Allan's modest, well-maintained cottage. There was a warm, inviting glow coming from inside. After hours of sitting on a cold, unpadded seat, the thought of some home comforts seemed appealing. As Richie approached the door, the delicious aroma of home cooking drifted by, reminding him by means of a stomach rumble that he was hungry. Placing the satchel under one arm, he paused to take breath and then knocked 3 times. After a few moments, muffled voices could be heard coming from inside, along with the sounds of approaching footsteps. The door swung open to reveal an attractive woman in her late 20s. She was tall, with long, dark, plaited hair, dressed in a dark green bodice and long, flowing skirt. Her bright blue eyes surveyed Richie, and she smiled politely. "May I help you, sir?" Richie nodded in return. "Hi, good evening. My name's James Ritchie, and I'm looking for a Mr. Douglas Allan. Have I come to the right place?" "Aye, sir, you have," she replied. "Would you like to speak with him?" Richie nodded. "Aye, ma'am, that'd be much appreciated." The young woman briefly turned her head round, and Richie sensed that she was silently beckoning to someone inside. Then came the sound of the man's voice. "Mary, don't leave the poor man standing out there in the cold. Invite him into the warm." The woman turned her head back to Richie and stepped back, swinging the door open. "Aye, well, come away in then, Mr. Ritchie." Entering the humble and inviting room, Richie's eyes immediately caught sight of the remains of the apparent evening meal. On top of a long wooden table stood 2 wooden bowls, a small loaf of bread and 2 mugs. To the left there was a large open fire which hung an iron pot. On the right there what appeared to be a sleeping area divided by a large tartan blanket tied to either side of the opening in the stone wall. As he stepped forward, the woolen blanket parted, and a tall, unshaven, powerful-looking, dark-haired man in his 30s appeared, dressed in tan breeches, white shirt and a woolen waistcoat. "Good evening, sir. You'll be from Mr. Hardy's office, aye?" Feeling somewhat intimidated by the sight of this gentle giant, Richie placed the satchel on the table and politely extended his hand. As the 2 men shook hands, Richie couldn't help thinking that he wouldn't like to get on the wrong side of Dougie Allan. "Aye, sir, the name's James Ritchie. Mr. Hardy has sent me with a proposal for you to consider." Releasing hands, Richie reached for the satchel. "If you'll permit me to stay for a while and talk it through with you, it'd be good of you." "Aye, of course you can." A moment later the door was closed, and the woman was standing beside her husband. "Mr. Ritchie, sir, this is my wife Mary. She makes a fine broth, and you look cold, sir. Would you care for a bowl?" Giving a courteous but enthusiastic nod, Richie smiled. "Aye, it smells grand, Mr. Allan. That'd be braw." Pulling out a wooden stool, Richie sat as Dougie placed a tankard full of milk in front of him. Moments later, Mary returned with a wooden bowl full of steaming, thick vegetable broth. Thanking her, Richie picked up a spoon and eagerly ate the hot soup in barely a minute. Then, as Dougie and Mary grinned at each other, he reached for the tankard of milk and enthusiastically gulped down half of the contents. Dougie stood up and walked over to the small fireplace. He reached down towards a pile of misshaped logs, picked up 2 and placed them carefully onto the dying embers of the fire. Seconds later, the fire seemed to burst into life, revive like a thirsty man who had just been given a glass of water. "It's good to see that you enjoy your food, Mr. Ritchie. My wife will be pleased that you like her broth. Now, if you please, tell me more about this proposal from Mr. Hardy you mentioned." Swallowing the remainder of the milk, Ritchie wiped his lips on his sleeve and placed the tankard down onto the table. Turning to his left, he could see that Mary had risen and had made a move towards the large blanket dividing the room. "If it's fitting, I'll leave you to your business, gentlemen," she said as she walked away. Both men suddenly stood as if Mary had royal blood running through her veins. Richie smiled and nodded with a sense of genuine gratitude. "I'm most thankful for your kindness, Mrs. Allan." The young woman smiled and gave a nod before disappearing behind the blanket. As the fire crackled in the semi-darkness of the cottage, both men returned to their seats. Staring at each other on opposite sides of the table, Richie leaned across, picked up the leather satchel, and untied the drawstring. Opening the bag, he reached inside and pulled out 2 large pieces of parchment. "Mr. Allan, you'll be familiar with the Erskine folk and their plans for the silver mine." Dougie smiled wryly. "Okay, I ken all about the plans, but I don't want to get involved with politics." Richie raised his eyebrows. "You'll forgive me for saying so, but this has nothing to do with Sir John's Jacobean interests. This is purely business, Mr. Allan." "Aye. Well, in that case, I've known about the plans. And I believe you've had a wee bit of bother safeguarding things, I hear." Pausing for a moment, as if to catch his breath, Richie swallowed and said, "Aye, well, if you're referring to MacArthur, then you'd be right. But there's been no evidence to suggest that any stealing has taken place." He paused for a second time, and then continued, "On the contrary, there's no evidence at all." Looking down at the parchment, Richie paused and gazed back at Dougie, who looked genuinely confused. Richie continued, "Mr. Allan, my employer has given me the power to seek you out, to secure your services. Mr. Hardy would like you to take the position of mine manager for the forthcoming project, and he's willing to pay you a most excellent salary of £10 sterling each month." Dougie sighed, stood up and walked across to where a clay pipe and a small box of tobacco lay on a table beside the fireplace. Picking up the pipe, he took out a pinch of tobacco from the box and filled the pipe. Kneeling down at the fireplace, he picked up a small piece of wood and used it to light his pipe. Moments later, small circles of bluish-grey smoke rose from the pipe, as the sweet aroma of burning tobacco filled the room. He then stepped back to the table and retook his seat. £10 sterling each month, that's a lot of money, Mr. Ritchie, sir. Sounds to me like there's maybe more to the matter than meets the eye." Well, at least it was a positive comment, thought Ritchie. It's obvious that he was interested. After all, he didn't say no, did he? £10 for a good job, Mr. Allan. That's all Mr. Hardy needs to be certain that there'll be no more mishaps take place." "Mishaps?" said the big man. "Is that another word for trickery?" "Nae trickery or anything, Mr. Allan. It's just that Sir John would rather see any silver taken from his land remain in his family rather than folks like MacArthur getting at it. I'm sure you understand." Looking at Ritchie, Dougie raised his eyebrows. "I will tell you this, sir. I don't know this MacArthur myself, but from what I've heard, he's a good man." "I never said he wasn't, sir. It's just a wee bit suspicious." Ritchie glanced down at the papers and looked back at Dougie, who was still puffing away at his pipe. For a moment, Ritchie thought he'd struck a nerve and upset the big man. Deciding that he didn't want to offend him further, getting to the point seemed to be the best course of action. Ritchie said, "Until there's evidence, there's nothing we can do. The fact is, Mr. Allan, Sir John is in need of a manager." Pausing for breath, Dougie sighed and then continued, "So, Mr. Allan, sir, £10 sterling a month to manage the mine and ensure good security is maintained. Do we have a deal?" Dougie leaned back and took one final puff of his pipe, placed it down onto the table and licked his lips. With a small grin appearing on his face, he leaned forward. "Aye, Mr. Ritchie, sir. Aye, we have a deal." With the agreement made, the two men shook hands. Ritchie felt satisfied, almost as if he had conquered some ancient foe, and the feeling of intimidation he had experienced at the beginning of their meeting had now faded. Who knows, he thought, perhaps even Mr. Hardy will be pleased at the result. It was around 7 p.m. when James Ritchie finally left the Allans. With the satisfaction of a deal done and the contract signed, Ritchie bid farewell. "You should be there first thing on Monday morning, Mr. Allan, and the best of luck to you." Dougie smiled and returned, "And to you, sir. Good night." Within minutes, Ritchie's carriage had departed. All that could be heard was the faint muffled sound of carriage wheels disappearing into the darkness. Dougie closed the wooden door. "Is he away?" came a soft voice from behind. "Aye," said Dougie softly. Mary approached him and wrapped her arms round him, and as he stroked the back of her hair, they hugged. "Are you sure about that job, Dougie?" Pulling her head back gently with his large hands, He stared into her blue eyes. "Aye, my love. It'll be braw, and besides, it's nae often it's possible to earn £10 for a month's work, is it?" Dougie again embraced his wife, continuing to stroke her hair. He felt her take a deep breath and softly exhale. "Aye, Dougie, I suppose it's nae," she whispered.